I never thought a $5 million check could get torn to pieces right in front of my own son. At first, it looked like a family argument spilling into a public lobby. But by the time it was over, I'd bring down an entire bank. A pathetic broke military washout. Like you could ever get your hands on this kind of money unless you were doing something crooked. My brother Marcus's voice cut through that lobby like a blade. Right in front of my terrified son, he snatched the $5 million check out of my hand, tore it clean in half, and threw the pieces down onto my scuffed combat boots. The sound of that paper ripping killed whatever was left between us. Somebody call security. Arrest this thief right now. He screamed it with a kind of triumph, trampling his own brother's dignity in front of a lobby full of strangers. I watched that torn check flutter down onto the marble floor, tightened my grip on my son's hand, and felt my eyes go cold. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I offered him nothing. Because what Marcus didn't know was that his little phone call to security had just detonated a classified $750 million government contract, one big enough to wipe this bank off the map entirely. Before I get into it, if this story means anything to you, hit subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. As those torn pieces of white paper drifted down onto my mud-stained boots, the humiliation dragged my mind backward. Not forward. Backward into a wound I'd spent years burying under discipline and silence and the smell of engine grease on some overseas base 10,000 miles from home. I looked down at the frayed hem of my faded tactical jacket. My ex-wife had pointed at that same jacket in disgust the night she packed her bags and walked out for good. She'd stood in our cramped little living room, suitcase already zipped, keys jangling in her hand, and jabbed a finger at the olive-drab fabric hanging over the kitchen chair. She called my service a pathetic excuse for a career. Said our son would grow up embarrassed of a father who chose mud and gunfire over a real paycheck. Said she'd found someone who understood what a woman actually deserved, some tech executive downtown who could give her the life I was too stubborn and too broke to provide. I'd been standing at the sink washing our son's plastic cereal bowl when she delivered that verdict on our marriage. I remember the warm water on my knuckles. I remember the soap sliding between my fingers. I remember exactly how her voice sounded when she said our boy would be better off without me around. She didn't kiss him goodbye. Didn't even glance at his door where he was asleep with his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his chin. She just slammed the front door hard enough that our wedding photo crashed off the wall and shattered across the linoleum. I found the glass shards under the fridge 3 days later, barefoot, bleeding from cuts I never even felt happen. That memory burned in my chest like battery acid every single day since. My own family always measured a soldier's worth in dollars, and the number never added up in their eyes. My brother had sided with her during the divorce completely. Told our parents I'd driven her away with my stubbornness. Told anyone who'd listen that I deserved to end up alone. I swallowed that memory down, ground my boots into the marble, and pulled myself back to the reason I'd walked into this glass fortress 15 minutes earlier. My son and I had parked our old, reliable truck in the packed lot outside the Ellsworth branch of Sterling National Bank. The exhaust rattled against the frame as I killed the engine. Red dust from the dirt road out of Cedar Hollow coated the hood and the cracked windshield. My son unbuckled and grabbed his backpack, the one with the busted zipper he refused to let me replace because his best friend had drawn a lopsided dinosaur on it in permanent marker. He slung it over one shoulder and waited by his door for me to come around and open it. Small ritual we'd kept since he was old enough to sit up front. Our plan for the day was about as simple as it gets. Deposit the government funds. Walk 3 blocks to the bookstore for the comics he'd been saving his allowance for. End the day with pulled pork and sweet potato fries at the barbecue place by the highway, the one with the flickering neon pig sign. That was it. No spectacle. Just a quiet Tuesday. I'd kept my real identity hidden for years on purpose. Not one teacher at my son's school, not one neighbor on our gravel road in Cedar Hollow knew the truth. They saw a tired single dad in dusty clothes driving an old truck, mowing his own lawn on Saturdays. They had no idea that underneath that, I was a full colonel in the United States Marine Corps, a senior Department of Defense representative personally overseeing hundreds of millions in veteran housing and pension funds across 17 states. I kept it quiet by choice. I wanted my son to learn that a person's character, his integrity, his word, is what defines him. Not a label, not the badge on a car hood. I wanted him untouched by the same disease that had eaten away at my brother from the inside, the same disease that had walked my ex-wife right out our front door. The second we pushed through those heavy glass doors into the VIP lobby, the temperature seemed to drop. The room reeked of expensive espresso and quiet entitlement. The marble floor was so polished I could see the scuffed soles of my own boots staring back at me. 3 young tellers stood behind the counter, laughing, scrolling their phones. The moment their eyes landed on my faded cargo pants, my weathered face, my son's wrinkled cotton shirt, their smiles vanished. One nudged the other and whispered behind her hand. The second one wrinkled her nose and turned her back. They didn't even try to hide it. We'd been silently filed under trash. Meanwhile, men in $1,000 suits and women with handbags the size of duffel bags got personal escorts and fresh cappuccinos before they'd even reached the counter. A man with a golf bag got his coffee before he was in line. A woman in heels that clicked like a metronome got walked straight into a private office by a manager who practically bowed. My son and I stood at the entrance like ghosts nobody wanted to acknowledge. I'd seen this exact dynamic play out in combat zones halfway around the world. The powerful ignore the vulnerable. The uniform serves. The served forget. I felt my son's small hand tighten around mine, his instinct sharper than any radar I'd ever operated. He could feel the hostility rolling off that staff like heat off asphalt. I didn't shrink. I took a breath through my nose and straightened my spine, letting 20 years of discipline settle back into my body. I locked into the same squared stance I'd used walking through hostile territory on 3 continents. The government check, $5 million, red-stamped and official, sat flat against my chest in my breast pocket, as heavy and steady as body armor. Holding my son's hand, I walked straight toward the counter. I had no idea that by taking those calm, deliberate steps forward, I was walking straight into the middle of my brother's fragile ego, and that this quiet Tuesday was about to detonate into chaos. The cold, silent rejection from that staff was so blunt that even my 8-year-old could feel it in his bones. He stopped walking. He tugged at my sleeve, pulling the fabric up toward his chin, forcing me to look down at him. His eyes were wide and confused in a way that could crack steel. He leaned into my leg, trying to shrink himself, trying to disappear from the dismissive stares of the guards by the counter. In a small, shaking whisper, he asked me why the well-dressed people in this beautiful building weren't friendly like the cashiers back home. He asked if we'd done something wrong. He asked if it was because of his backpack. Something in my chest cracked straight down the middle. He was getting his first real taste of prejudice, and it was ugly. Watching him search his own conscience for a fault that didn't exist, trying to find something wrong with his shirt or his bag to explain why grown adults wouldn't even look at him, lit something in me that no amount of training could fully cap. I dropped to one knee right there on that cold marble, letting the stone bite through my cargo pants. I used my own body as a wall between him and every judgmental stare behind us. I put my hands on his small shoulders, brushed his hair back, and locked eyes with him. "Be patient, bud," I said, keeping every ounce of warmth I had in my voice. "Don't ever assume the worst about someone before you know them. We came here to do a job, and we're gonna finish it." I squeezed his shoulder once, firm, passing whatever strength I had left into him. He needed to know that real resilience means keeping your own honor intact, even when the world decides to treat you like garbage for no reason. He needed to know none of this was his fault. He nodded slowly, straightened his back. "My boy. A soldier's son." I stood back up, rolled my shoulders, and reset for whatever was waiting at that counter. That's when the manager's office door swung open with a sharp click that cut through the lobby noise like a gunshot. My brother stepped out. Marcus was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my truck was worth. Hair styled, watch flashing, cologne announcing him a full 3 seconds before he actually arrived. His eyes scanned the lobby with the authority of a man who'd built his whole identity around controlling that room, and they locked onto me instantly. I stood still, searching his face for even a flicker of the brother who used to walk me to school. I found nothing. Just cold, calculating contempt as his gaze dragged from my boots up my jacket, over my son's cheap shirt and dinosaur backpack, and back to my face. In 1 second, he'd run the math and decided I was worth less than the espresso he handed his VIP clients. I braced myself, reading his posture the same way I'd read a hostile approaching a checkpoint. The lifted chin. The tense shoulders. The smirk already forming. He was gearing up for a public execution, and he wanted an audience. I refused to give him the satisfaction of flinching. I took 3 long strides to the counter, reached into my jacket, and keeping eye contact the whole time slid the $5 million government check across the glass. That was my opening move in a fight I never wanted. Marcus stepped up, heels clicking, and stared down at the string of zeros on that check. His pupils didn't dilate with professional interest. They dilated with pure envy. The idea that his failure of a younger brother, the one who'd thrown his life away in the mud, was holding millions in authorized government funds shattered whatever was left of his fragile ego. He raised his voice, loud enough to carry across the whole lobby. He wanted witnesses. "A broke failure like you. How the hell do you have a $5 million check in your hands?" He hissed it under the chandeliers, publicly accusing me of fraud, using our shared blood and his little title as manager to maximize the humiliation in front of every stranger in earshot. His tellers stopped working. His guard stepped closer. I didn't flinch. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my military ID along with the stack of red-stamped DoD authorization papers, slapping them down on the glass hard enough to silence the room. "Put the grudge aside and do your job," I said low and even. "Call the Treasury hotline. 2 minutes and this is verified." 2 minutes. That's all it would have taken. A young teller stepped forward, breaking the standoff. Her tag read Emily Carter. Mid-20s, sharp eyes, and more integrity in her than everyone else in that building combined. Her own father had done 2 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took his leg below the knee. She recognized my rank insignia the second I set it down and offered, hands shaking, to take the paperwork back and verify it herself. Marcus rounded on her like she'd committed treason. Threatened to fire her on the spot. Promised to blacklist her across every bank in the state, take her apartment, her insurance, everything her family had left after her dad's medical retirement. Emily shrank back, buried her face in her hands, and slid down against the file cabinets, sobbing. Having crushed the only decent person in the room, Marcus turned back to me, drunk on his own authority, refusing to even glance at the government seals sitting right in front of him. Verification was never the goal. Destroying me was the goal. It had been the goal since I walked through those doors in clothes he considered beneath him. He flicked my military ID off the counter with one manicured finger like he was flicking a bug off a plate. You think these scraps of paper fool me? By rejecting the truth outright, he sealed his own fate. He chose to turn this into a spectacle because his pride couldn't survive his brother standing taller than him. Not even for 2 minutes. Not even with proof sitting right there. His voice acted like a dinner bell. Customers abandoned their transactions and drifted toward us, forming a tight crescent around the counter. Phones came out. Flashes started firing. Nobody stepped in to ask a question or de-escalate anything. They just wanted content. A man shouldered his way to the front of the crowd. I'd learn later his name was Charles Whitfield, some regular trying to score points with management. Poorly fitted suit, gold watch he made sure everyone saw. Manager Price is right. Look at this disgrace. Probably using his own kid as a prop for some sympathy scam. He pointed straight at my son on that last line. Not just an insult, a blade aimed directly at an 8-year-old's mind. The crowd nodded along. Some laughed. My son recoiled, grabbed fistfuls of my pants, and pressed his face against my leg. I felt his tears soak through the fabric. The fury of a father and the instincts of a Marine colonel collided in my chest like two freight trains, and I forced both of them down into a vault. Marcus! Stop! Before there's no way back for you. My voice dropped into the register I used for final orders before a firefight. Hardest thing I'd ever had to do, harder than any deployment, was giving a warning like that to someone who'd shared a bedroom with me for 16 years growing up. He smiled at me like I was nothing. Drunk on the crowd cheering him on, he lifted the check over his head like a trophy and tore it in half. Then again. And again. He turned a multi-million-dollar children's fund into confetti and threw it into the air, letting it rain down onto my boots, the marble, my son's backpack. That's exactly where you belong. My son dropped to his knees, scrambling to gather the torn pieces like he could somehow put it back together. I pulled him up by the shoulder. I would never let my kid kneel in front of that man. Not that day, not ever. You just ended your own career with your own hands, Marcus. That's the moment he grabbed the desk phone and screamed for security. He pointed at me and barked an order at his head of security, a mountain of a man named Grant Dalton, shaved head, thick neck, hands like dinner plates, the kind of guy who clearly enjoyed pushing around anyone smaller to earn a nod from management. Grant unhooked his cuffs and shoved through the crowd, scattering bystanders. Hands behind your back, fraud. He ignored my ID sitting right there on the counter. Ignored the crying kid pressed against my leg. He wanted the show, not the truth. As he swung those cuffs forward in a wide, careless arc to force compliance, his forearm came within inches of my son's face. My boy flinched back just in time, cheek catching the air off that swinging arm. Time stopped. Every nerve in my body lit up at once. Before Grant could finish that swing, I deflected his arm with my forearm, redirected his momentum clean past my son's head, pivoted my hip inside his guard, and locked his arm into a joint hold I'd drilled 10,000 times on training mats from Paris Island to Okinawa. No punch needed. One twist, maximum leverage, and a man 250 pounds heavier than me dropped to one knee on that marble with a sickening thud, completely immobilized in under 3 seconds. The crowd gasped as one. Instead of grasping the magnitude of what she just caused, a guard swinging metal restraints inches from a child's face, Marcus pounced on the moment. Pointed at my takedown and screamed to the crowd. You see that? He's unstable. Military PTSD. A violent psychopath. Calculating, cold, aware of exactly the story she was building for the cameras, turning my service, my scars, into a weapon against me. Diagnosing me in front of a mob. It was the sickest betrayal I'd ever felt. I let go of Grant instantly and kicked his cuffs across the floor. Anyone lays a hand on my son, I will break their arm. My voice rattled the glass teller partitions. I stepped back, dropped my arms loose, palms open, facing out. Textbook surrender posture. Every camera in that room caught it, proof that I wasn't some wild attacker, just a trained officer using minimum force to protect his kid. More guards closed a half circle around us, batons crackling with live current, pushing us back toward the entrance step by step. Behind the counter, Emily was still crying into her hands. The crowd stayed dead silent, filming, apathetic, not one person lowering a phone or saying a word. My son buried his face in my leg, shoulders shaking. Then he looked up through that forest of hostile strangers, tears cutting clean lines down his cheeks. "Dad, you bled to protect people. Why won't any of them protect you now?" My chest caved in. That wasn't a question. It was an indictment of every person in that room who'd chosen a phone screen over basic decency. I crouched, blocked the flashes from his face with my body. "It's okay, buddy. We don't need protection from cowards. If a question like that from a crying kid hits you, hit the like button. Drop a comment if you've ever stood alone against a crowd like that, because what happens next is the payback you're waiting for." The guards kept tightening their circle, forcing us back toward the glass doors. I counted my breaths, 4 in, 4 out, locking my rage down in a vault, mentally preparing my son to watch me get cuffed in front of a cheering crowd. Then the whole room shifted. A shadow fell across the entrance behind me. The doors hissed open. Richard Ashford, CEO of Sterling National, walked in flanked by 4 attorneys in identical black suits. He hadn't come for a routine visit. He'd flown in personally to finalize a $750 million Department of Defense pension contract he'd spent 6 months negotiating in Washington to save his company's collapsing stock price. His polished smile froze the second he crossed the threshold. He took in the shredded confetti on the floor, the guards with live batons pointed at a man in a military jacket, the crowd filming, Grant on his knees clutching his wrist. Then his eyes landed on me. His most critical client. The sole authorized signatory on a $750 million contract. Cornered against his own glass doors with a crying kid attached to his leg. His briefcase, containing the signed contract of the century, slipped out of his hand and hit the marble with a crack that echoed through the whole lobby. Every head turned. "Colonel Cross, what in God's name is happening in my branch?" The fear and respect in his voice hit that crowd like a shockwave, obliterating the illusion Marcus had spent the last 20 minutes building. Grant dropped his baton like it had caught fire and scrambled backward, realizing exactly what he'd just done to a federal officer, and how close his cuffs had come to a child's face. Marcus started hyperventilating, plastering on a fake smile as he rushed toward Richard, babbling that she'd sorry that he'd stopped a dangerous fraudster. Expecting praise. Richard walked past him like he was furniture. Stopped in front of my boots, straightened up and bowed his head. Apologized, voice cracking with fury and shame, for the disgraceful incompetence of his staff. Then he turned that same fury on my brother. "The man you just humiliated, whose check you shredded, whom you called the police on, that's Colonel Damian Cross, senior representative of the Department of Defense. He holds sole authority over the $750 million contract that is the only thing keeping this bank alive. That check was legitimate government funding, confirmed by email this morning. You didn't just destroy federal property. You slandered a decorated veteran." The crowd's phones, recording what they thought was a beggar getting removed, were suddenly capturing a decorated colonel being abused by his own running the branch. The whole narrative flipped so hard it gave the room whiplash. Phones lowered. Faces went white. Charles Whitfield, the man who mocked my son, slipped quietly to the back of the crowd, trying to vanish. The color drained completely from Marcus's face. He collapsed to his knees, crawling toward me, grabbing at my pants with shaking fingers, clutching the very uniform he'd mocked minutes earlier. He called me brother. Family. Words he hadn't meant in 45 years. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Just a cold, clinical emptiness. The military taught me to risk my life for this country, I said. It never taught me to tolerate cruelty, even from my own blood. I pulled my leg free, tearing the fabric slightly where his nails had dug in. I looked up at Richard. I want Marcus Cross and Grant Dalton terminated immediately. Badges pulled, handed to police. No quiet resignations. Sirens swarmed the entrance within minutes. Officers arrived expecting a violent criminal. Instead, after seeing my rank, hearing Richard's testimony, and reviewing footage of Grant swinging cuffs near a child, they lowered their weapons and saluted. Marcus was walked out in handcuffs, screaming as they read the charges, filing a false police report, attempted extortion, destruction of government property, assault by proxy. Grant went into the second cruiser right behind him. By nightfall, the footage had gone viral, but the story had flipped completely. Every major outlet ran it. Sterling National's stock cratered as a boycott exploded overnight. The apathy of that filming crowd, the very thing Marcus counted on, became the fuel that burned his career down. That night, with news vans camped outside my house in Cedar Hollow, I sat alone in my kitchen. My son was finally asleep, backpack still clutched to his chest, face streaked from crying. I stared at my old uniform hanging on the chair, the same chair I'd been leaning against the night my ex-wife walked out. A photo of Marcus and me, as kids, sat on the shelf. I took it down and set it face first on the counter. No joy in what happened to him. No triumph. Just heavy, permanent silence. I'd severed that bloodline for good. The brother who once walked me to school, gone, hauled off on live television. Sitting there in the dark, my son's question kept echoing. Why won't any of them protect you now? If I hadn't had that contract as a shield, I'd have been in a holding cell that night while Marcus celebrated with champagne, and my son would have been sitting in a stranger's office wondering where his father went. The whole system was rotten. Firing one manager wasn't enough to cure it. 3 days later, Richard Ashford and his board showed up at my front door in a convoy of black sedans that looked ridiculous on my gravel driveway. They crowded around my scratched kitchen table, sweating in my unair-conditioned kitchen, sliding blank settlement checks across the wood, begging me to sign the contract quietly and call off the boycott. They thought everyone had a price. I slid the checks back. One fell to the floor. Nobody picked it up. I don't sell my silence, I told them. Firing one manager doesn't fix a system that let her thrive for years while everyone above her cashed their bonuses. I slid my own list across the table instead. Free banking services for every veteran and military family nationwide, effective in 30 days. An independent discrimination hotline staffed by outside auditors. A full purge of every person Marcus had promoted or protected. A management promotion and full scholarship for Emily Carter. And a permanent scholarship fund in my son's name, the Ethan Cross Fund for Children of Fallen Soldiers, financed by the bank's annual profits forever. Cornered, bleeding money, facing the biggest boycott in banking history, they signed every demand without hesitation. 3 months later, the news vans were gone. My street was quiet again. I walked my son through the doors of that same branch, same jacket, same boots, same backpack with the busted zipper. Nothing about us had changed. But the bank had. Plaques honoring veterans hung on the walls that used to radiate nothing but contempt. A framed copy of the policy I'd forced into existence sat behind the counter in a case of dark walnut and glass. And behind that counter in a tailored charcoal suit, name badge gleaming, stood Emily Carter, assistant branch manager. She saw us and her hand flew to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. My son didn't ask why people were smiling this time. He didn't need to. He already understood the only lesson that actually matters. Real power isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about building a shield for the people who can't build one themselves and forcing a cold world to change, one demand at a time. Sometimes justice isn't decided in a courtroom. It's decided by the choices we make. This was Cold Verdict. Because every story has a verdict.